Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I'm joined this week by regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, one of three reps from Brattleboro. Hey there, Emily.
Hi, Olga. Good to see you again and glad to be here with Zon.
Yes,
Mhm.
very happy to see you on Estes.
Actually, it's Eastes.
Eastes. You know, it's so funny, Zon. I will give Zon a proper introduction in a moment here, but you and I have known each other for years, but whenever I deal with your last name, it's always been in print.
Yes,
So,
exactly. Well, and yeah, yeah. So many people say, when I started making signs or whatever, people said, make your first name big because that's what everybody, that's how they know you. They don't know your last name, which is right. So fine. So good.
well, I'm so glad you're here. And for those who may not know, Zon is running in the Democratic primary that is happening on August 13th to represent Windham District 1, which is the towns of Vernon and Guilford. He is running against Jason Herron, who's also running on the Democratic ticket. Zon currently serves as chair of the Guilford Select Board. He is active in several arts organizations and initiatives across the state and nationally, including the Vermont Creative Network and the Vermont Arts Council. He is a teacher, a conductor, musician, man of many talents. So he has taught at the Brattleboro Music Center, which I think is where you and I actually first met many, many
I
years
think so,
ago.
yeah, many
Um,
years ago.
and then Amherst, Dartmouth, and Keene State Colleges. And he is currently the music director of Juno Orchestra, which I'd love, Zon, if you would tell us a little bit about Juno.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, exactly. Happy to. Just for a minute. Juno Orchestra actually got its start about 7 or 8 years ago now. It was started as just a project. It had a beginning and an end, I thought. And it was one of those projects, like so many, that got sort of kerwanged by COVID, but it started in 2017. I had actually had a couple of fine musicians. They gave me their cellos. Can you believe that? A student and then my sister-in-law gave me really fine cellos, and I sold those cellos, and I decided rather than just keep that money myself, because I'd already gotten use of one of the cellos for 25 years anyway. I'd used it already and a lot and earned money with it. I decided I would use that money to turn it back into the community and hire musicians for this project. So I imagined it might be like a 5-year project. And it was turned out to be a little longer, a little bit different than we thought because of COVID. But then at the end of the project, the Brattleboro Music Center, which had sort of been sponsoring us, although it was a standalone project, they'd sort of been helping out. They decided to take Juno on as an actual program, one of their programs, like the school or the chamber music series or the camps that they run in the summer. So now we're in a project, we're in a moment right now where we've entered into a 3-year agreement, and we're just about ready to start year 2. We had a very successful first year, and we'll go into year 2 here in a moment. It's a professional orchestra, varies in size from about 15 to 35, depending on
Oh,
what we're doing with
wow.
the program. So, and most of the musicians come from around this area. We're a very rich area, as we all know, in arts and culture here, but there are some remarkable musicians, classical musicians in this area too. So I'm very lucky to be able to have this opportunity to work with them. So there you go. That's Juno. Mhm.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Zon. And one reason I asked is I have a feeling you and Emily and I will be talking about the creative economy in
Mm,
part of our conversation. And I thought Juno was a nice way to highlight all
yeah,
the ways that the creative economy kind of moves through our community and we may not even see it.
yeah,
And
exactly.
it's very small things to quite big things to 5-year projects that become, a permanent program.
Yeah,
at a long running institution like the
sure.
Brattleboro Music Center. So thank you for that, Zon. I have some questions for Zon, Emily, but I want to give you a chance to jump in if there's anything you wanted to add. Nope.
No, I'm just like excited for the ride. I'm excited to learn more about you, Zon, and like I'm gonna try to limit myself to imagining like exactly how you'll fit into the legislature when you're elected, because I want you to be able to make your own way without being pigeonholed by your past experience. But I am just really excited for like all of the various skills and Renaissance man character that you bring to the work
Yeah.
you're about to
Oh,
do.
thank you.
Yeah.
Very kind. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I like what you said about Renaissance Man, Emily, because I think a lot of people would think of something like chairing the select board and being a musician as two very different skill sets, and yet they do overlap. And that's where I wanted to start, Zon, is when you think of your life experience, where, how have they prepared you
Oh,
for the State House?
yeah.
As
Well,
you imagine it, reality will be
yeah.
different, but as you imagine
Yeah, well,
it.
that's for sure. If I get elected, I'm sure I'm going to hit a wall of learning that I've never quite encountered before. So I'm anticipating if I get elected that there'll be, a really strong uptick in my awareness building here. The story that when people ask me a question like this, I'll go, the story that I keep talking about is um, I conducted the local community orchestra here in Brattleboro, the Wyndham Orchestra, for over 20 years. And I wouldn't have known it at the time when I went into it or when I started doing it. But I know now by looking backward that it probably did more to prepare me for this kind of work than just about any other experience. And the why is because every Monday night for 20 years, I would sit in a room with 50 to 60, 70 people, all of whom had very different capacities, abilities, all of whom were playing different instruments. So they were coming with different agendas, all who were from professionals down to, barely scratching by amateurs. But they had a love of what they were doing, and that was to get toward a Beethoven symphony or an amazing piece by Dvorak or something like that. So the experience that I honed over years was being able to accept everything that I was hearing in the room and yet at the same time begin to cajole it toward a goal. And it's not even my goal. It's the goal that we all have in front of us, which is to produce an amazing or some sort of an experience, a meaningful experience with, for instance, a Beethoven symphony. And it's remarkable when I realized that, there's no denying that an oboe player and a violin player are coming at the music from very different points of view. And you just have to work with that. You have to find a way to make it go. And so I think that kind of experience has really made it possible for me to be a good listener, because that's part of what you have to do when you're a conductor is you listen and then you try to bring out the best of every single instrument, every single person in the orchestra so they can perform and do what they want to do in order to make this thing really work. Um, and when you start, it never ends up where you think it was going to go, except that it's a Beethoven symphony. You do know that much, but you could listen to Beethoven symphonies till there weren't any more recordings, and every single one of them would be different. So there's a different outcome every single time. That's part of the magic of all this, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. So I think when people ask me, how am I prepared for the legislature? I think it's this way that, maybe we don't know what the outcomes are going to be. They're not as directive as a Beethoven symphony, but Vermont folks have values. I've heard a lot about those as I've door knocked, and I think there's a lot out there that we can work with already. So there, how's that?
Works for me. How about you, Emily?
I really appreciate that. And, I know Sarah Coffey, who holds the seat right now, and Selena
Yes.
Colburn, who's actually a former representative from Burlington, both are choreographers and both talk, really quite
Right.
extensively about choreography and how that prepares them for the State House. And I love all those flavors and angles of those of us who work in fields that are really about sort of like bringing people together around a common goal and like finding the one in the many and the many in the one. And it's just incredible to me how many ways we can approach this work and still do it really, really well. And I
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
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 I think what I love about what you said, Zon, it reminds me of, it's a cliche, but in the world of arts, they always say, oh, the show must go on. No matter
Yes.
what happens, the show must go on. And that's one thing I have appreciated about performing music or singing in my high school days was, it just, no matter how bad things got, it gave you kind of the guts to keep going and pushing through hard problems
Exactly.
sometimes.
Yes.
That's something I've always appreciated.
Yeah, I have good friends who are in the theater, and they say if you want something done and you want it done on time, ask a theater person, and they will somehow figure it out to get it done. And I think that all the world of creativity works that way because we
Mhm.
all work under deadline. I think there's this misperception that the larger community sometimes thinks that creative people are just kind of loosey-goosey and kind of mindless in a certain way. But I've never, the people that get things done, if you look at some of the highest functioning CEOs around the country or in the world, they're often people that have theater or music or art in their backgrounds. They may not be actively engaged in it, but they know about that kind of discipline. And that's what's really important in all of this work, I think.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I'm struck by is, the work in the legislature and in politics is just really hard, right? It's a
Mhm.
grind, there's divisiveness, it's
Mhm.
like success is deeply unclear on even the best days. And for me, I need to be able to find like the absolute beauty and humor and music in all of it each day in order to keep going. I have, sort of a dear friend who has also like really enjoyed sort of watching bureaucracy, and we talk about like the grandest carnival. Um, but I think that will also be sustaining for you, Zon, or I hope at least it is, that can see that, you're always searching for sort of the best sound in people.
Yeah, yeah,
Because I think
sure.
that's also just to get through the day and to see the big picture of the year or the biennium takes that angle.
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe that's another aptitude or skill I can bring
Yeah.
because the first time out when you read a Beethoven symphony with an amateur orchestra, you're not going to get very much that's really there. It takes a while, even though you have the image in your mind, or some sort of image. It takes a while to work it all out, and
Mhm.
that can be both frustrating but also incredibly rewarding when you finally get to the right place. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, I think these conversations are so important that we've been having with folks, that Olga and I've been doing on the show for, quite a few cycles now.
Okay.
Um, because I think when you're campaigning, folks ask you like, what do you stand for and what are you going to get done?
Mhm.
But frankly, like until you get into the biennium, you really don't know what work you're going to be doing or what you're going to be able to accomplish, what you'll have the opportunity for. And I think the most important thing for a lot of um, voters is to really understand how you're going to tackle
Yes,
problems or
I
Yeah.
think
agree.
about things or just like how you carry yourself in the world. Like,
Yeah.
are you able to say like yes and no clearly to someone, right? Like, can you analyze a problem and find your way to the other side? That kind of stuff. And so I think sometimes these questions around like, how does the orchestra relate to politics feels like softballs, but I think in the end, like I think it's actually the most important piece of how you're able to serve folks. And so I appreciate this
Yeah,
conversation.
great. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true that when Emily, people have asked me what do I stand for, and I just say right up, I don't have any answers right now. I wouldn't pretend to because that's not the way I work. The way I work is going and working and finding out where the movable parts are, and then seeing if you can bring answers to those movable
Mhm.
parts. And sometimes there are movable parts that nobody even discovered yet because the right kind of questions weren't asked or whatever. So that's the mode that I feel I'm going to be best suited for. So that's why I think this makes sense for me right now.
Mhm. And curious on why now?
Oh, well, The real truth is that I have actually considered running for office in the past, way back, 20, 25 years ago. But my life just never was in the right place. It's always something that's kind of intrigued me. I've always watched, I'm very interested, maybe not so much in politics, but in the notion of representing and serving and how that all works. And I've really been intrigued by that. I've talked with various people in the past about running either for the House or for the Senate, but it's never worked out in my life. And of course, in the last, well, I'll just tell you quickly that when Sarah, I just read on a Thursday that Sarah was gonna be stepping down, and it was surprising news to me. So I immediately contacted her and said, "Wow, Sarah, this is big news. What's up? Who have you got on board, and all that kind of thing?" And we talked a little bit about and by Sunday, it was clear I had made the decision. So in 3 days, I I was not even thinking about it at all this time around because we just assumed Sarah would continue. And then I had to do some really quick thinking because it was at the end of my wife's life. She died in the beginning of June, and I made this decision at the end of May. So it was really, I didn't know that Peggy was going to die so soon. In the beginning of June, we knew it was coming. And so I was trying to imagine how my life could go forward with the possibility of a run and potentially serving in the House. And I just decided that this might be a good next step for me, given everything as it would be. And it turns out that Peggy and her inimitable grace managed to, make space for me to really jump into it full force and without any kind of distraction here. So that's really great. Yeah, thank her.
Mm, well, so sorry for your loss, Zon. It's
Thank you.
always a heartbreak.
Yeah, it'll take a long time. I mean, even though she had dementia for 10 years and we knew this was all coming, it's still very difficult and very compelling. It's just really compelling. And I just had a very good friend of mine in high school just 2 days ago who just suddenly lost her husband. So it all comes rushing back over me again. This, loss, the sense of loss. So
Mhm.
it's powerful stuff, but it's also it can play into this whole mechanism, this machine that I'm now kind of enrolled in a certain way. It has a way of helping me actually. Gravitas, it helps me understand what's important and what's not important as we go through the race and all of
Mhm.
that kind of thing. So it's been good. Yeah.
When I was um, doing some caretaking last year of some family
Mhm.
members, um, it really taught me a lot about community systems and
Oh
where they
yeah.
were strong and where they were
Oh yeah.
weak. And I'm wondering for you, have going through this process with Peggy, did it teach you about new things about Vermont, about your community,
Uh,
about where our systems need improvement?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Surprisingly so. I mean, the biggest lesson I learned, and it shouldn't surprise anybody, but the biggest lesson I learned is about love and the remarkable compassion and care that the caregiving team had for Peggy. It was almost too much to behold at times. It was just so incredible how much they cared for Peggy, and we were able to keep her at home until the very end of her life. But I also became a small business owner because I had to employ these caregivers. So and that's not something that's been part of my life. I've not run businesses as a small business owner before, and I know that Vermont is filled with small businesses. Guilford has 150 small businesses. None of them is a major business at all, and so I gained a real bath of information and experience about what goes on in those situations, and the amounts of money that are required to just make a business work. And I didn't get deep into it. I haven't been doing it for years. It was temporary, but it gave me a new appreciation for that whole situation.
Mm.
And then the other lesson that I would say that I learned is just in the flexibility of people, and that systems don't have to be absolutely tight, and they're flexible. And so looking for the places where we can make differences, where we can make adjustments in the way things are handled. I mean, as I've door knocked, I've talked with a lot of people. I mean, everyone is rightfully concerned about the increase in taxes. It's very troubling for a lot of people. And I don't know, I don't have any answers for anyone. But I'm not also certain that the way that we're currently doing our tax structure is the right one. So I'm ready to. I think there's morphing. I think there's some development there in that, and it's full of hard questions and hard answers. I get that. But I think I'm well suited for being able to begin investigating a lot of this stuff and figuring, doing what I can to figure it out, and then make as much sense as we can to people. It's very difficult. I understand. Very complicated. I don't pretend to know, but I do understand the difficulty of it and the complexity of it. Yeah.
I have a question about that I've been thinking about a lot as I've been knocking on people's doors. And it's sort of the balance between Vermonters' desire to not see anything change ever. You
Yeah.
know, like I still call the convenience store on my corner the place where 7-Eleven used to be, you know. And I'm not the one calling it what Christie's used, where Christie's used to be, which was before that. But like what, and who knows like what built. Anyway, I think everyone knows this scenario. And, the number of people I've talked to who say like, I grew up in this street, how much this town has changed, et cetera, et cetera. And the fact that like everything's always changing, whether we want it to or not. And
Right.
so ideally we are managing that change rather
Right.
than letting that change take us.
Yes.
I think in the context of education finance, and actually most of our state systems, we sort of put Band-Aids and duct tape on the
Mhm.
challenges
Mhm.
because, large structural change is more than Vermonters want.
Yes.
And so how do we manage that like sort of reality that sometimes we've really sort of hit the wall of what's possible to shift without people experiencing it as change?
Yeah. It's really a tough one, isn't it? I mean, I think that you've already said the kinds of things that I think about, that, change is inevitable. It's coming at us all the time, has been for years. What I think is interesting, and maybe a lot of people don't, is trying to be an active player in creating the best changes. When change is required, and it is required, how can we all author that change so that we're not just victims, and but we're actually part players. So I realize this. I've been in plenty of experiences where I know that sometimes you have to make the really hard choices for the bigger picture, for the longer haul. And that's hard to do, but it's necessary to do sometimes. But always in the balance. I love the Vermont state motto, freedom and unity. The notion of the individual's rights and our ability to live free and unhindered, and yet we're together, we're in community, we have to function that way. So that to me is the dynamic that we're working with all the time. So I think that having developing what would you call it, the framework in which change can happen, because it's actually happening, but we're all collectively a part of working on that together. That seems to me a place to go. I don't know. I'm sure I'm naive, but yeah.
No, I really appreciate what you said, Zon, because um, change is simply something was one way and now it's another. It's not necessary. It's kind of neutral on whether it's positive change. The outcomes will be positive or negative. And so I appreciate you bringing that sense of consciousness to like, where is this actually, change is happening. How do we craft it so it can go in a positive direction? Because I think while as someone who also gets frustrated by many communities who don't want to change, I think we also have to acknowledge that sometimes when change has happened in Vermont, it may not have been change that benefited the local community, right? And so we need to kind of
And
be
who's left behind.
yeah, and who's
Yeah.
left behind. And so
Yeah.
there is some genuine fear there that has
Oh,
good
sure.
reasons to be there.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have just a couple minutes before we have to go to break. But I want to check in with Zon. Is there anything you want to leave listeners with before we hear from some underwriters?
I think that, I'm ready. I just would like to say that I'm ready. I think it's a good moment in my life, and I think I have some good skills to offer to Guilford and Vernon, and then to the legislature. I've had the opportunity already to work in the State House quite a bit. I worked at the Vermont Arts Council for 6 years, and my job, I wasn't a grant maker. I was on the advocacy side of things. So I spent a lot of time in the State House working and talking with legislators, and was part of the budget process and all of that. So I'm not claiming I know how it works, but I have a good feel, I think. And I sort of sense the vibe, and I've lived that, the up there, down here life already for a number of years. So I think it's kind of a rhythm that makes sense to me. So I have that to offer.
It's good that you know what you're getting into. I really like
Or at
genuinely
least a
like
vision of it. Yeah,
I
exactly.
love that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Zon, Emily. We will be back here on the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, in just a few moments after we hear from some underwriters. So don't go anywhere, folks. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I'm your producer and host of the show, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who's one of 3 reps from Brattleboro, as well as candidate Zon Eastes, who is running to represent Wyndham 1, which is the towns of Guilford and Vernon, in the Democratic primary that's happening on August 13th. Before we dive back into the conversation, I want to quickly thank Brattleboro Community Television for taking the video version of our show and sharing it with other stations around Vermont. And Ms. Emily, what do we need to remind listeners of?
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, respectively, not the station, nor platform, nor employers, nor friends, pets, anyone but the people talking. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Zon, this is a question I always get really curious to ask folks who were not born in Vermont. You grew up in Kansas and then moved to Vermont, I believe, in the 80s. And the reason I always like asking this question, just I'll give you some context, is I grew up in Vermont. My family kind of straddles the Franklin, Massachusetts, Windham County communities. But I'm sort of, in a way, I'm here by default, family, friends, that type of thing. So I'm always curious when people come to Vermont and make it their home. Like, what called to you to make Vermont your home?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, my story is like so many other Vermonters. I like that question too, Olga. I like to talk to people about that. I find it really interesting. But so I was in graduate school, and the degree program I was in, as a musician, I'm a cellist. So I was studying cello, and the degree program I was in allowed students to not be at the campus to finish their degrees if they wanted to. So in other words, I could get the academic work done, which I did, and then you could go be anywhere because what you were doing was performing. So they didn't really care where you were. So I sort of rather accidentally hit upon Brattleboro. I mean, I'd heard about Brattleboro because one of my girlfriends in the past was a flute player, and there was a very famous flute player here, Marcel Moïse, who had moved here from
Yes.
Switzerland and was here, settled here. Turns out with the Moïse family, whom I knew nothing about. I just heard of Marcel Moïse. But anyway, I came to Vermont thinking that I would be here for 1, maybe 2 years while I was practicing. I wanted a place to practice and just kind of hole up. Well, that was over 40 years ago. And so what happened, it was a series of incremental adjustments incremental decisions. They are all based on finding a community that made sense to me. Over and over and over, there was opportunity for me that if I just kept opening doors, I found more and more ways to be engaged that were meaningful to me. For instance, I started at the Brattleboro Music Center teaching, and then pretty soon I became the conductor of the Wyndham Orchestra. That was very compelling for me as a young man. I started teaching at Dartmouth College. I started teaching at Amherst College, and little by little, I was kind of in the community, performing and playing and teaching and all of that. And then I was a regular member. I also I got very engaged in, not just being a musician, but what is it about being a creative soul with other people in a small community like this? I grew up in Kansas, in a town that had very few cultural opportunities. It's a lot richer now than I'm since I've left, but it was very little when I was there. So here I am. I just am a product of repeated opening doors, and so that's that's kind of why I'm here in the first place on this show. Is because we're opening another door here for me, possibly, and at this slightly advanced stage. But here we go.
Thank you. I love it. I love it. I keep going back to a few weeks ago, we had Emily Karras Duncan
Oh
on the
yeah.
show who's running for rep in Whitingham on the Democratic ticket. And I think she put it well. She says, once Vermont gets a hold of you, it's kind of got you, I think
Yeah.
is somewhat paraphrasing her words. Um,
Well, yeah, well, it's absolutely true because of the quality of life here is continuously remains so high, and that's one of the reasons that really intrigues me to think about serving is that I think I have a sense of the amazingness of Vermont. It is an amazing place, and I think it deserves to remain that way. So I'm interested in furthering that as part of the service that I would be engaged in. Yeah.
Curious, you've talked a bit on your campaign page, but I believe I've heard you talk about it in other places, and that's the idea of a vibrant rural economy.
Mm.
And I'm curious for you, how do you define that? What would that look like for, say, Guilford and Vernon? I would say they have strong economies right now, but are they vibrant?
Yeah, I think again, I'm learning. I'll say that right out. I'm learning. I feel like I know Guilford fairly well, but I don't feel like I know Vernon all that well. Certainly, the presence of Vermont Yankee for so many years in Vernon and the changes that Vernon's going through right now and trying to chart for themselves, it sets them in a particular kind of mindset, a particular kind of trajectory, a life they were living, and there are a lot of questions about what that means going forward. I think their planning commission is working hard right now to try to delve into those kinds of questions. So it's almost like the notions of what a vibrant rural economy is fairly different for Guilford and Vernon, is the impression I have. I think Vernon's based on the notion of having large businesses as part of the community, but big businesses that really, and America is very familiar with the idea of big business sort of setting up shop and working in a community and doing various things in the community, positive and negative. And then when those businesses leave, what happens? How does that work? And positive and negative. And I think that's at maybe a high level. That's maybe the discussion that's going on in Vernon. It is pretty different in Guilford, and because, like I said, there are no large businesses here, but there are many people who are very, very creative and entrepreneurial, and are working to make their businesses work. It's not about getting bigger necessarily. It might be in some cases. It's not about all just expanding scale. That's not necessarily the issue. But how do you make these businesses vibrant? What sort of support systems are there available? What infrastructure exists or doesn't exist that ought to exist that could make life easier or make it more, make them able to function better in the community? One hears, or I hear a lot, I'm sure, we all have, I've heard repeatedly that Vermont makes it more difficult to operate a business than some other places. And so again, I don't know too much about that. I hear those words and I believe those people when they say that. So I'm intrigued to find out what some of those issues are, and are there solutions that we might be able to bring? Are there, changes that could be made that would make life better for folks? And again, it's all about a balance. I get that, but trying to figure out, are there ways to make things work?
There's
So
this really amazing process maps on that I hope I can find and you can see that sort of maps the disconnections between a few different pieces of like regulatory and technical assistance that we have for businesses in Vermont. That is like, I mean, a more absurd process map a person has never seen. And so I think
oh, I
that
see.
part of it is just like we are constantly balancing in Vermont between being a small rural state with not that much capacity and thinking that we can do better and more, right? And like sometimes that results in like a bunch of stuff that's not connected to each other because we never own the solution we're working towards. And that's highlights a question I have about Guilford and Vernon. So I think sort of the popular imagination in Windham County, or at least in my version of Brattleboro, about Guilford and Vernon is that like Vernon is more conservative and Guilford is more whatever, left, progressive. But I think it's really interesting that like that's true, sure, maybe like if you look at political counts, but Vernon has like a very strong town government,
Yes.
lots of right, like paved road, like a really huge municipal government apparatus, right? That's capable of serving the folks there in a really comprehensive way. Guilford, you don't even have zoning, right? And
Right.
so like if in traditional Vermont politics, you would think that those two scenarios would be reversed politically, right? Like big government, the left, small non-government, the right, you know? And so it's interesting how Guilford, in a lot of ways, like in terms of town government, like replicates some kingdom towns even.
Yeah, yeah,
And
there you go.
yet, like Vernon, yeah, it's just I think I find that part really fascinating
Yeah,
too.
yeah, that's a good description in the sense of, things aren't just exactly what you think they are when
No.
as you dig in a little bit more, you find out it's actually a fair amount more complicated, which for me makes it a lot more interesting.
Yes,
And
agreed.
so, and it doesn't mean there have to be answers, quick answers that just, get everything perfectly clear, which never works. But it strikes me that, understanding some of these, again, the flexible nature of all of this is pretty interesting. Yeah. I will say one of the things when I was working on helping to establish the Vermont Creative Network, when I worked at the
Mhm.
Vermont Arts Council, I just ahead of the Vermont Creative Network, kind of in kind of this collective way of thinking, was the Farm to Plate Network, which
Mm.
had about 2 or 3 more years running in front of the Creative Network. And one of the things that I found really interesting about about the Farm to Plate Network was they had done what's called an asset map, where they never done
Right.
that across the entire agriculture, food, and whatever. And they developed this asset map. It was a big process. It took them quite a while. And they discovered, just like Emily was describing, where there are some disconnects and where there are maybe too many connections, but then there are some
Mm.
places where there aren't. And they realized, I remember hearing one of the folks from Farm to Plate say, you mean if we just if we just click this lever right here, it'll make this flow differently? And people were going, yeah. And nobody had ever thought of it before because
Yeah.
they just hadn't gotten out quite far enough to take the overall look at things. So that kind of mindset really intrigues me, being able, if it's possible, to get out far enough to take a broad look at what's going on. And I believe Emily when she says that there, to look at a map, you can just see there are lots of disconnects. That's going to really interest me, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about the process map she mentioned as well, because I'm amazed at the number of people who are in Vermont who are sole proprietors or small business owners, however they want to define themselves. And while we do have training through things like the development corporations and things like that, a lot of people, I don't know that we have a culture of training entrepreneurs. Do you know what
Yep.
I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
Well, one of the reasons for that, Olga, I think, is that, for instance, in the Creative Network, uh, you know, uh, it's very easy in Vermont to talk about the arts and to talk about the and this and people kind of get it in the state of Vermont. It's a nice thing. We love that we're so arts and culture oriented and all that. It's kind of like even sells people who might want to work at a hospital or something like that. The fact is, there are lots of people that actually work in the creative economy, and if you ask them, they don't consider themselves to be part of the creative network or even part of the creative economy. They don't see themselves as actually being in it. And so when an organization like the Vermont Arts Council offers training to people in the creative sector, many people just they don't even see themselves as being a potential user of those kinds of services. So it's a lot about self-identification, and I think there are probably many businesses in the state of Vermont, very small businesses that don't realize, oh, I'm doing what other people are doing. I may not be doing the exact same thing, but I'm really, my issues are the same as everybody else's issues, and I think that that's something that it's a constant battle. You got to keep working on that. It's communication. You just have to work
mhm.
on it all the time. Yeah.
Before
Broadening.
we dive into other parts of the conversation, two things. One, it's hot in my house today, so I've got the windows
Uh,
open. I apologize if you're hearing any motorcycles going by. Um, they like my road. And two, Zon, would you just take a couple minutes and let people know what the Creative Network is? Because I think it's actually a really great thing, but I don't know that a lot of people know about it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the Creative Network is still operating. It's a major program of the Vermont Arts Council, and the Creative Network has been established by the legislature, the Vermont legislature, in 2016. So it's actually a recognizable thing, and what its aim is to bring together, in just the ways I was talking about, bring together every institution, every purveyor, every organization, every individual that's connected to the creative economy. And in Vermont, that means a broader range than most people think of it. Like, for instance, um, in the creative, we count in it's about creating a big tent. And so the big tent in Vermont includes things like historical museums or libraries. It includes publishing houses, even newspapers. It includes landscape designers, people who use creativity who as a way of making decisions, a way of moving through your life. So really the point for me, Olga, is I think every single person is a creative person. And to me, it's a little artificial that we even have to talk about the creative economy, because I really do believe that every single person, even if they don't think they have a creative bone in their body, they're making decisions through processes that are creative processes. And that it's about bringing together people that understand this, and then trying to and deepening, I think, its place in the Vermont community. The fact is, to go one step further, all the problems that exist in Vermont are the problems we all have. They're not part of the creative sector. They're not part of the healthcare sector. They're not part of the education sector. These are problems that we all deal with. And the point for me is we need all the voices working together to solve the problems. It's not the politicians that are going to solve the problems alone. It's not this or that that's going to solve the problems. It's because we use creative processes. That's how we need to solve our communities, our regions, our states' problems. That's my view.
You
That's a
hate.
sorry, kind of a high horse there. Sorry.
You mean
I love
soapbox?
it.
We jump on and off soapbox all the time on this show. You are more than welcome. Emily, I think you had a question about the communications union districts.
Yeah, and before we get to that, so I think communication union districts are an example of a time where
Mm.
Vermonters got together and said,
Yeah,
like, here we have a market failure. Let's think creatively about a
yeah,
different way to do this, right? I do think there are times where there is actually like a fairly clear answer to a problem, and folks don't actually like that answer for whatever reason. And so they say, well, there must be a creative way to do this,
yeah.
instead of like, like I think creative funding is, and that's maybe this is like my pet peeve as the tax lady, but like we can't use like money is still money, and sort of like creative funding is not necessarily going to make more money fall from the sky when the
Right.
system doesn't have it, right? And I think the communications union districts are an incredible example of what happens when people got together and thought creatively about a place that Vermont, just like as with many places like our housing, we, because of our demographics and
Mm.
our geographic sparsity, we have a market failure situation, and that's okay. It just means that government's going to need to, help move the needle. So, and
Yeah.
my understanding is you were really involved with the communications union districts, which we have not talked about on this show
A
in
while.
a couple years, maybe. Yeah.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. Well, I agree with everything you're saying. To me, they were a response to an issue that was not getting solved in the normal American way. That's one of the things about Vermont is it's just somehow maybe not all that American in lots of different ways. And this was an example of that. The large corporations were not interested in dealing with Vermont's topography, Vermont's geography, Vermont's rural aspects. I mean, it would be so much easier for them if all 620,000 Vermonters were all clumped in one place. They could do what they need to do really quickly, but that's not how we choose to live. So it becomes a different kind of problem. Yeah. So I was involved with the Deerfield Valley CUD for Communications Union District for about 2.5 years at the very beginning when it was getting started. I was Guilford's representative appointed by the select board to be on that. So again, sort of like my work at the Arts Council, I was not involved in the technical aspects. I was not, I wasn't overworking in how are we going to get the telephone wires from here to there. That was not my job. But I was involved on the communications side, which is exactly the work I had and the advocacy work that I had at the Arts Council. So it was a kind of a natural slide over for that. I'm very impressed with the entire state of Vermont, how quickly these CUDs sort of hummed up into the life of Vermont. Surely there were opportunities, there were some funding opportunities coming our way, but I was really impressed with and I don't even know how many towns are involved in the current CUD at this point because they were all happening and growing and changing pretty quickly. So I don't know where it stands right now in the Deerfield Valley CUD.
It's over
But
20, almost 30.
yeah,
Yeah.
that there were 20 to 30 towns who very quickly got, and that's only in this part of the state, who very quickly got organized around a set of values. That's really what drove it. Was the idea that we're going to make this work because this is the way we want it to work. It's sort of like we kept calling it the rural electrification project that happened 100 years ago. And that didn't happen by a big corporation coming in and solving the problem. It happened at the grassroots level. And so that's what's happening again with this. And it's working. It's beginning to really work. there are parts of the state that are a little bit more advanced than we are down here as far as getting lines up and getting people connected, but we're actually doing it down here as well. And there's a plan for offering everyone the opportunity in the entire district if they want to connect. I'm very much looking forward to a more reliable form of internet here in my Guilford location. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank
And
you.
I will just say one more thing. It was really, again, it was just people, and it was during COVID. So people sitting down, just like we are, looking at each other on screens and trying to figure out what the problems are and solving them with people that I didn't even know. Most of the people I'd never met before, because there were one or two individuals from every town. So it was really you had to be there because you were interested in the values and the project itself. Otherwise, there wasn't an opportunity to have any other engagement. It just didn't work that way. So we were able to really streamline the work because of being on screen and because of the force of the project. So it was really heartening, that kind of work, and I really value it.
Well, I think we should also give all the people across the state who volunteered for CUD work. I was interviewing a person up in Lamoille for their CUD, and
Mm.
when they started during the COVID, only way to meet was online, and many of them didn't have strong enough internet connections
Exactly.
that they would have to like leave the meeting and then come back, and like, so
Mm.
they were trying to do this very
Love
complicated
that.
work with
Yeah.
like tools that were not working, which is why they were doing the complicated work.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
we just kind of all need to say thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like, yeah, it's sort of like early film or something. It's like all the problems that existed in even making a film, just that's sort of what we were living with, moment by moment. Yeah, it's really something. Yeah.
um, we're nearly out of time, Zon, but I want to revisit something you said in the first half of the show, which was, and I'm paraphrasing, you are running because you're interested in serving, maybe
Mm.
not so much in politics, but in serving. And I'm wondering for you, what's the difference between politics and like serving your community?
Well, that's probably a big question, but I think that a quick answer, I think I would say that there are many ways to serve, but there are people who serve all over. Teachers, amazing teachers. There are people in the faith communities who serve. There are people who serve by volunteering in their communities, not politically, but just because they care about volunteering. There are lots of ways to serve, and it doesn't have to be out of just a personal drive. It's you really care about your community, a project interests you or something like that. So there are plenty of ways to serve without being political. And I think that that's really important for community. It's very important in Guilford. It's hugely important in Guilford. There's high commodity on serving that way. To serve politically means you're entering into a different sort of relationship, I think. And I think that we've certainly seen in our country how politics can be used not in service of people. And so I really truly am interested in serving the two communities that I would be serving if I get elected, because of the first reasons, because of wanting to serve, wanting to be engaged, wanting to make our communities better for the future with all the pressures that are coming. I have no political interests that I could imagine. Anyway, I'm old enough that I couldn't possibly have any. Emily has much more chance for political opportunity than I will.
First of all, for the
That's
80th
fine.
time, anywhere else in the state, I would be a firmly middle-aged, anywhere else in the country, I'd be a firmly middle-aged lady. But here in Vermont, I am like an upstart youngin.
Yeah, exactly.
I am solidly in the
I'll
middle of
just
my
say this.
40s.
When I told some folks that I was thinking of running up in some friends of mine at Montpelier, And I said, yeah, but look, I'm old. And one of them said, you're going to lower the average age. Get in
Truth,
there.
truth.
So we'll see what
Oh my.
happens.
But I also, I really appreciate what you said, Zon. And it really sort of like, I very much think of myself as a legislator and not a politician. Certainly could have even run for the Senate when there was a space opening and had no interest in doing it. And think of myself like more as sort of like a governance geek and like a community organizer than a politician. And I'll say, like, the day I was elected, I became a politician and I became a
And people
person who was
love
sort
this.
of morally suspect
Yes.
by like sort of the zeitgeist than I
Yeah.
ever could have fathomed would happen to me. Just like
Yeah.
I'm just like still the same person the day after and the day before, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that I think is the most interesting, not the most interesting. It's like a fascinating part of the whole thing. It's just like how
Yeah. Yeah.
all of a sudden the politician becomes everyone's projection of like a
Yeah.
bad person.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well,
And
yeah.
I've been trying to like re-embrace it as an attempt at doing something about that bad feeling, but I don't know what's to be done about it. But I think I want to try to find like what is good about the word politics or politician because I can't, it's really hard to like take on all the negativity about it. And I
Yeah.
don't know any other way of countering that
Yeah, I hear
weird
you. I mean,
distrust vibe.
yeah, being the chair of the Guilford Select Board, I mean, it's not exactly the same as yours, but I
Yeah.
definitely know the notion of, one day you were one way and the next day, whoop, you're something else altogether different.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting, it's a really interesting issue. And I think I talk about it a lot with people trying to understand it. I'm not sure there are good answers, but yeah, it's something to think about. I'd like to have some conversations with you about that, Emily.
Yeah. Let's do that.
All right.
And Zon, before we wrap today's show, what would you like to leave listeners with? You get
Well,
another chance.
the most important thing thank you for having me on. First of all, it's nice to be able to talk with folks about things that I care about, but also I think the most important thing that I'd like to get out there is that the importance of everyone in all the districts, but certainly in Vernon and Guilford, voting on August 13th. Don't presume that November 5th is your day to vote. We need to vote on August 13th because it's a very important election. And so while I have certain feelings about how you ought to vote, and I would love to earn everyone's vote, I realize that we're all there voting because we're activating our voices, which is a very important part of democracy, and I really believe in that. So I would just encourage everyone who's listening to take the opportunity to vote on August 13th.
Thank you. And as we know, early ballots are available,
Yes.
although time is ticking down. So if you want to vote by mail early, you need to make sure you request that ballot in time to get it in the mail and then return it either to your town clerk's office by the 13th or mail it in. But time is ticking, so just be aware of that, folks, as
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
make your plans around voting. And just a note to any other candidates out there, we had more candidates in this primary than we had Fridays in our schedule. So if you didn't hear from us, we apologize. Hopefully we will be able to connect with you before November 5th to still have conversations. And on that note, Zon, if people want to reach out to you or learn more about you, how can they do that?
They can find contact information at my website, which is my name, Zon Eastes, Eastes, VT. So zoneastesvt.com. I have a website.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Emily, how about you?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org and you'll find links to all of the social medias, email, phone number, great endorsements coming in from folks around the area, and would really love to see folks at the polls. Would love your support. And I'm just so grateful to have this conversation with you today, Zon, and I hope we can have many more conversations like this in the future.
Yeah, good. Looking forward. We'll see what happens. All right.
Thank you. Well, Zon Eastes, Emily Kornheiser, And all our listeners, I hope you all have a great weekend. The Montpelier Happy Hour will return on Friday next week. And of course, wherever you want to subscribe to your podcasts, or you can check us out on BCTV. Take care, everyone.